right, guys, so hopefully you've seen our part 1 video on the 1675 Gilt GMT. Our next segment here is really going to cover from 1966 to about 1980, and this is the matte dial variant. There's about 5 or 6 dial variants, and we're going to break those down individually and just kind of show you how we are determining what dial variation each dial is, the serial ranges, and just shortcuts on how to easily identify each dial. Let's start with the Mark 0 dial 1675. This dial was actually not known for quite some time. A lot of people thought this dial was just a reloomed Mark 1 dial. But in actuality, it was a very, very early 1675 dial. I believe the serial range that this comes in is 1.38 to 1.6 million for the serial. What you're going to look for is that it looks very similar to a Mark 1 dial in the way that we're going to look at this E in Rolex. You see how this prong, this middle prong of E is equidistant across all of these, across the horizontal plane. That is what we typically call a long E. In the Mark 0, what you're going to find in this serial range is that the luminescent material that's applied to this dial is a mixture of tritium and zinc sulfide. So for the longest time, people thought, well, this dial still glows, it must be reloomed. But if you look across 5513s and 1675s of this era, this basically transitioned, Rolex was using different types of luminescent material to transition into more of a tritium mixture. So after this Mark 0, there should be no glow for your 1675 GMTs. Let's look a little bit closer on this again. And as you can see, the middle prong of E is the same distance from the top and bottom. The crown is a little bit uniquely shaped as well. Let me change this, and you can see that you have this third prong that is a negative relief of the in between the crown, and it's a little bit deeper. But other than that, all you really need to do is between Mark 0 and Mark 1, you're really going to focus on whether the dial still glows or not, and then look at the dial texture. On these Mark 0s, you're going to notice that it's a little bit puffier. The height of the lume is going to be a little bit thicker than the waffle type textures of the other variant dials. So that's your Mark 0. And for those that are wondering where we're getting a lot of this information, a lot of this has been a result of the community logging and showing, barn finds and original owner watches, and confirming that there is this pattern of these watches appearing in a certain serial range. A good website to check out is gmtmaster1675.com. This is a great resource, and which we rely on heavily in terms of trying to identify which Mark dial belongs in which case, what the proper look and feel of the text should be. And all this is obviously important because you want to make sure that you have the right dial that matches the right case. So moving on, let's go ahead and move on to your Mark 1. This is our Mark 1 dial. Once again, this Mark 1 dial we're going to focus on is serial ranges between 1.6 and 2.9 million. What you're going to see is a little bit flatter lume compared to your Mark 0. Obviously, this should not glow on your Mark 1s. And once again, the identifying characteristic of a Mark 1, why they call it a long E, is all the other variant dials, the middle prong of E is shorter, whereas this one is longer. And so that's the easiest way to identify whether this dial is a Mark 1 versus a 2, 3, 4, or 5. You're also going to look at a number of things, characteristics on these watches, namely the insert. And maybe it wasn't as much of a big deal before, but insert prices, these thin little aluminum pieces have gone, especially for a redback insert, starting at probably $2,500, going all the way up until, well, if you talk about the Blueberry, they could be up to $30,000. But at the end of the day, for these 1675s, you're going to look for a redback insert. The bluebacks, which later appear in 16750s, do fit, but they are uniquely different in the sense that well, clearly in the name, one is a blueback, one is a redback. But some of these were used for basically service inserts and replaced the redbacks as they wore out. So jumping on, let's move on to the Mark II. And just for reference, this is another Mark I Fuchsia GMT. Another very pretty watch. Let's move on to this Mark II. So the Mark II is a bit different in the serial numbers because it appears in two ranges. We typically see them between 2.8 and 3.9 million serial, as well as 5.0 to 5.19-ish serial. So it can be in different years, in different categories, and this is one of the things that Rolex did back in the day. There's not a solid rule to follow, and you can't just typecast a certain dial that appears only in these years. Over time, as people have found watches and bought from their original owner or uncovered original owner watches, we see these dials, these Mark II dials, appear in later serials in that 5 million range as well. So keep that in mind, and don't let that deter you, as long as they fall within those serial ranges. But so for a Mark II, what I'm looking at is, obviously it doesn't have that middle prong of E elongated, right? The shape of that E is going to look like this and not like this. But what is unique about the Mark II is that if you look at the font of Rolex here, this middle or vertical line of Rolex is much thicker. I like to call these a fat L. Probably not the coolest nickname for a watch, but at the same time, it is something that's uniquely characteristic of a Mark II. This one has a very fat font insert, Pepsi insert as well. It obviously should be redback as well. There should not be any glow on this. And your Mark II, what you're going to look for as an identifying feature is, I'm not sure if you can see it very well on the screen, but you can see that there's like this wavy Band-Aid-like texture. And sometimes it goes from like left to right, sometimes it's up and down, but it looks like a Band-Aid-ish texture with dots and lines that is very characteristic of this generation variant dial. The next one is actually fairly easy to spot out, and it's a Mark III, otherwise known as a radial dial. And what makes the radial dial very unique is that the lume on the dial is positioned much closer to the post in the hands of the watch. So the whole dial actually looks a lot smaller than it really is, but it's the same 40 millimeter size. It just has very small lume plots. And so everything here, all these lume dots are moved closer to the center of the dial. And this is your Mark III. And I believe, I'm going to check my handy source here, the Mark III, you're looking at 4.1 to 5.4 million serial. So there is overlap. You're going to have multiple variant dials overlapping in certain years. So not all 1977 watches are going to be a Mark IV, not all vice versa, right? So I won't get into all the small details. But the Mark III is probably one of the rarest dials for the 1675. I would say probably only 10% or 15% of the watches that we come across that are 1675 happen to be in that radial Mark III range. Moving on, let's get into our Mark IV. Now the Mark IV and Mark V, these are kind of like the hardest ones to kind of tell apart. And let me see if I can pull up the Mark IV here. Here we go. So Mark IV and Mark V happened in the later 70s era Rolex watches. And in this 77, 78, 79 era, the lume plots actually appear a little bit bigger. And that's consistent with what you see in 5512s and 1680s. Lume plots are almost maxi size. So that's the immediate tell when I look at a Mark IV. Let me get into this. So we're gonna look for bigger lume plots. The easiest way I remember for a Mark IV is, if you look at the crown, and before I forget, let me go ahead and tell you the serial range. You're looking at between 4.1 million to 5.8 million, as well as a small period in 3 million to 3.3 million for serial. The Mark IV crown is something to notice. So if we're looking at the crown, what I'm gonna be focusing on is that fourth negative downstroke on that crown. It's actually longer than the rest of them. So if I were to draw something for you, so this is my impression of a Mark IV crown. 1, 2, 3. If this is your crown, let me change the color here. What you're looking at is this fourth downstroke is actually much longer than the rest of these. So that's how I remember the fourth Mark IV. The other one you can use characteristic you can use is I look at the letters HRCE in chronometer and certified. So the last two words on the dial. So if you see this HRC E and you drew a vertical line between H and R, it would perfectly split where the E is. So that would be Mark IV. Hopefully that makes sense, right? But the easiest way I could paint that for you is to look at this, the crown. Sometimes due to the printing, due to manufacturing tolerances, that negative relief may not be as apparent as other dials, but that's my first key indicator, as well as trying to match it up to the serial numbers. We'll move on to the Mark V, which also has maxi size plots. So once again, maxi size plots, Band-Aid textured lume. As you can see on this Mark V crown, that fourth indentation is not as deep, right? So that's my first tell. The way to confirm this is we're looking also between 5.0 million to 5.9 million for serial range. The other way to look at this is, once again, we're looking at H. Let me use a different color. We're looking at HRCE. Once again, if we were to split a vertical line between H and R, you'll see that the C basically lines up between the H and R, versus where in the Mark IV, the E kind of lines up perfectly in between H and R. So that's the easiest way to look at these. As you can tell, if I'm going back and forth from the Mark 0 all the way to the Mark V, you're looking also at the shape of the insert and the thickness of the fonts are going to be much more sharp and thinner as you move on through the variants versus, let's just bring up the first one again. Where's that Mark 0? You can see how thick that font is on these, right? Versus your Mark 4, etc. So that's a quick crash course on the Matte Dial 1675. Obviously, there's a whole different section of gilt dials that we can get into, but we'll save that for a different episode. Try to make that as short as possible, so hopefully Paul can cut this and make it succinct and efficient for you guys to follow along with. But leave a comment, like, subscribe. I feel like I'm a YouTuber. Let us know if there's any other tricks that you guys use to kind of differentiate these dials, and yeah, any other tips and tricks are happy to be received and shared. But otherwise, if you guys like these types of videos, we'll continue to do so. I think making one for the Maxi Dial 5513s would be really cool. If there's any other references that you think we should talk about, let us know. Take care, guys.
Another day, just believe. Another day, I'm used to it by now.